London, September 1818. The morning fog clung to the narrow streets of Bloomsbury like a shroud, muffling the sounds of cartwheels and street vendors' cries. In a modest cottage on the unfashionable edge of the city, Miss Vivienne Carter stood at her writing desk, her fingers trembling as she broke the seal on a letter that would alter everything she had resigned herself to accept. At 28 years old, Vivienne knew precisely what society thought of her. The whispers had long since ceased to wound as they once had. Poor thing, past her prime. What a waste, really. All that intelligence with nowhere to direct it. She had made peace with invisibility, or so she told herself on mornings when the silence of her small cottage pressed too heavily against her chest. The black wax seal was embossed with her uncle's crest, a falcon in flight. Lord Edmund Carter, her father's elder brother, had been a distant figure throughout her life, more legend than relation, and now, according to the solicitor's precise script, he was dead. If you believe in second chances and stories that transform lives when hope seems lost, subscribe now and join us on this journey. You will not want to miss what happens next. Vivienne read the letter 3 times before the words penetrated the fog of disbelief. Her uncle Edmund, the eccentric bachelor who had spent 30 years traveling the continent collecting botanical specimens, had left her everything. Willowmere Estate in Yorkshire, 150 acres of gardens and woodland, £12,000 in carefully managed investments yielding £700 annually, furniture, paintings, a library of 2,000 volumes. The sheer scale of the shift overwhelmed her. From genteel poverty to comfort, from dependence on distant cousins' benevolence to independence, it was impossible. It was astonishing. Then she reached the condition. The marriage clause lurked at the bottom of the second page, a poisonous viper hidden amongst the roses. She must marry within 6 months of her uncle's death, the union to be completed no later than March 1819. The marriage must be deemed genuine and formed from true affection, not mere convenience. If she failed to meet this requirement, or if the marriage was judged to be a sham, the entire inheritance would pass to her cousin Reginald Montford, and the person granted sole authority to judge the authenticity of her marriage was Lord Sebastian Montgomery, Marquis of York, executor of the estate and her uncle's closest friend. Vivienne's hands crushed the letter, crumpling the expensive paper. Her uncle, whom she had seen perhaps a dozen times in her entire life, now controlled her future from beyond the grave. The gift he had given with one hand, he had poisoned with the other. The outrage of it burned in her throat. For 8 years, she had endured the pitying glances and disappointed sighs of matrons who had once called her promising. She had refused 3 proposals in her 20th year, young men who had seen her as a convenient alliance rather than a person worth knowing. She had chosen dignified solitude over a marriage built on mutual indifference. Now society would see her scrambling to secure a husband before the deadline, desperate and humiliated. They would call her a fortune hunter, an aging spinster willing to sell herself for comfort. The sting of truth lay heavy in that prediction. The knock at her door came as she was pacing the length of her small drawing room, the letter still clutched in her hand. Her housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson, a widow of 50 with kind eyes and no illusions about their circumstances, appeared in the doorway. "Pardon, Miss Carter, but there's a gentleman here to see you. Says his name is Lord York, that he's expected." Vivienne's breath caught sharply. "Lord York, here, now. Arrived in a very fine carriage, miss. Shall I show him in, or would you prefer to receive him another time?" Another time. As though she had the luxury of postponing conversations with the man who held her future in his aristocratic hands. Vivienne straightened her spine, tucked an errant curl behind her ear, and gestured toward the door. "Show him in, Mrs. Dawson. And perhaps some tea if we have enough of the good blend." "We'll make do, miss," Mrs. Dawson said with the kind of gentle certainty that had sustained Vivienne through 8 years of making do. The man who entered her drawing room 3 minutes later was not what she had expected. Lord Sebastian Montgomery, Marquis of York, stood well over 6 feet tall. His dark hair shot through with silver at the temples, despite his evident youth. His face was all hard angles and aristocratic breeding, the kind of face that might have belonged to a Roman senator. But it was his eyes that arrested her attention, grey as winter storms and holding a depth of weariness that spoke of grief, long carried. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the small space. "Forgive the intrusion. I thought it best to call on you immediately after you received the solicitor's letter." "My lord," Vivian managed, executing a curtsy that felt absurdly formal in her modest cottage. "Forgive my poor welcome, my lord. Please, sit. Tea will arrive momentarily." He folded himself into her father's old armchair, with the careful grace of a large man accustomed to smaller spaces. For a long moment, they simply regarded each other, the silence broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sounds of the street beyond. "You must have questions," he said finally. "Dozens," Vivian replied, pleased that her voice remained steady. "Perhaps we might begin with why my uncle, whom I barely knew, decided to orchestrate my life from beyond death." A flicker of something crossed Lord York's face. Surprise, perhaps, or approval. Edmund had his reasons. He was never a man to act without careful consideration, however peculiar his methods might appear. "Peculiar," Vivian repeated, the word tasting bitter. "That is certainly one description. Manipulative might be another. Controlling would not be inappropriate." "All accurate," Lord York agreed, startling her with his frankness. Edmund was aware of these defects of temper. He spoke of them often in his final months, when the consumption had made him contemplative. Mrs. Dawson arrived with the tea tray, the good china that had belonged to Vivian's mother, arranged with careful precision. She poured for them both, her hands steady despite the oddness of serving a marquess in their humble cottage, then withdrew with a meaningful glance at Vivian. "You said he had his reasons," Vivian said once they were alone again. "I confess I am eager to hear them. What possible justification exists for forcing a woman of 8 and 20 into the marriage market like some desperate debutante?" Lord York accepted his teacup, his large hands making the delicate porcelain seem impossibly fragile. "May I speak frankly, Miss Carter?" "I would prefer it to polite evasion, my lord." "Very well." He set down his cup and leaned forward, his grey eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Edmund believed you were wasting your life. He said you had chosen invisibility as a shield against disappointment, that you had convinced yourself that being overlooked was preferable to being seen and found wanting." The words hit her like a physical blow. Vivian felt heat rise in her cheeks, a mixture of shame and anger warring in her chest. "He had no right to judge how I chose to live." "No," Lord York agreed quietly. "He did not. But he loved you in his peculiar way. He spoke of you often, of the young woman who had asked the most acute question about botanical classification he had ever heard, who had corresponded with him about scientific matters, with such insight that he could not fail to overlook you were not a fellow scholar." Vivian's breath caught. She had written to her uncle exactly twice 10 years ago, after reading his published papers, on the cultivation of exotic orchids. He had responded with detailed enthusiasm, treating her observations with the respect he might have shown a colleague. The correspondence had lasted 6 months before fading into silence. She had assumed he had lost interest, that her questions had become tiresome. "He kept your letters," Lord York continued, "all 14 of them. He showed them to me 2 years ago, when he first began to plan his will. He said you had a mind that deserved better than to languish in obscurity, that you needed someone to see you truly. And so he decided to force me into marriage," Vivian demanded, though her voice had lost some of its edge. "How is that seeing me truly? How is that not simply another form of being told what I should be?" "Perhaps because he was not specifying whom you should marry," Lord York said. "Only that the marriage should be genuine, that it should be built on affection rather than convenience or desperation. He wanted you to have what he never allowed himself." Something in his tone made Vivian pause. "What do you mean?" Lord York was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving to the window where autumn light painted the street in shades of gold. "Edmund was in love once, 30 years ago, with the daughter of a country vicar. She was brilliant and beautiful, and utterly unsuitable by the standards of his family. He was young, barely 20, and he had not yet come into his title. His father forbade the match." "And he obeyed," Vivian said softly. "He obeyed," Lord York confirmed. The young woman married someone else within the year. Edmund never forgave himself. He spent 3 decades traveling, collecting, studying, filling his life with everything except what he truly wanted. In his final months, he spoke often of cowardice, of the life he might have lived if he had been brave enough to choose love over duty. He did not want to see your existence curtailed, as his own had been by a father's cold ultimatum. Vivienne felt something stir in her chest, the anger bleeding away to leave something more complex in its wake. Understanding, perhaps, or recognition. And so he thought, to spare me the same regret. He hoped you might have the courage he lacked, Lord York said. Whether his method was wise or cruel, I cannot say. Perhaps it was both. And you, Vivienne said, studying the man across from her with new attention. You agreed to serve as judge of my marriage. That is a considerable burden of judgment. Surely you must have your own opinions about this arrangement. I do, he said simply. Edmund was my closest friend. I owe it to his memory to execute his will as he intended. But I want you to understand, Miss Carter, that I have no desire to see you forced into an unhappy union. The condition was meant to encourage genuine affection, not to trap you. Then you would not object if I chose not to marry at all? Vivienne challenged. If I decided to refuse the inheritance rather than submit to this manipulation? Lord York's expression grew thoughtful. He placed his teacup down with quiet precision. I would not object, but I would ask why you would choose poverty over the possibility of happiness. Because happiness cannot be commanded, Vivienne said, her voice sharp. Because love does not grow on demand, regardless of deadlines and inheritances. Because I spent 8 years learning to be content with solitude, and I will not pretend to sentiments I do not feel simply to satisfy my uncle's posthumous meddling. Then we are in agreement, Lord York said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. I will not ask you to pretend anything, Miss Carter, but I would ask that you consider the possibility that your uncle saw the truth you fear to acknowledge. And what might that be? Vivienne asked, standing to face him. That the life you have built is safe, he said quietly. But safety is not the same as fulfillment, and invisibility, however comfortable it may feel, is still a kind of death. He departed a few minutes later, leaving Vivienne standing in her small drawing room with her tea grown cold and her carefully constructed peace thoroughly shattered. The weeks that followed brought a flurry of activity that left Vivienne dizzy. The solicitors arranged for her immediate access to a quarterly allowance from the estate, enough to keep her cottage and expand her modest household. The deed to Willowmere would transfer upon her marriage or revert to Reginald Montford if she remained unwed past the deadline. Letters arrived daily from distant relatives and acquaintances who had not deigned to acknowledge her existence in years. Invitations to dinners and soirees appeared with startling regularity. The respectable invisibility she had cultivated was replaced by a different kind of attention, equally uncomfortable, but marked by a clear calculation. They smell the money, Mrs. Dawson observed tartly one morning, as she sorted through the latest batch of invitations. Vultures, the whole pack. Perhaps some are sincere, Vivienne suggested, though without much conviction. And perhaps the moon is made of cheese, Mrs. Dawson retorted. You mark my words, miss. You'll have a dozen proposals before Christmas, and not one of them will be worth the paper it's written on. The prediction proved uncannily accurate. Within 3 weeks of the inheritance becoming public knowledge, Vivienne received her first proposal. The gentleman in question was a widower of 50 with 6 children and a mortgaged estate. He assured her that she would make an excellent mother and household manager, that her advanced age made her ideally suited to a man who required practicality rather than romance. She declined with as much grace as she could muster. The second proposal came from a younger son with expensive tastes and no prospects. He spoke eloquently of their mutual interest and shared love of literature, though he had yet to mention a single book he had actually read. She declined more firmly. By October, she had received 5 proposals, attended 16 social events, and developed a new appreciation for the simple peace of invisibility. The marriage market, she discovered, was every bit as degrading as she had imagined 8 years ago. The only difference was that now she carried the taint of desperation, the knowledge that her time was running out. It was at Lady Helmsworth's autumn ball that she first encountered Mr. Philip Waverley. The ballroom at Helmsworth House blazed with the light of 100 candles, their glow reflected in the polished marble floors and the jewels adorning the throats of the assembled ladies. Vivienne stood near the refreshment table, a strategic position that allowed her to observe without actively participating, when a voice spoke at her elbow. "I confess, I had not expected to find anyone else seeking refuge by the lemonade. The truly desperate usually position themselves near the dance floor." Vivienne turned to find a gentleman of perhaps 30 years regarding her with amused grey-green eyes. He was handsome in a conventional way, his fair hair artfully arranged, his evening clothes cut to perfection. But it was his smile that caught her attention, warm and seemingly genuine in a room full of calculated expressions. "Perhaps I am desperate in a different way," Vivienne replied before she could stop herself. "Desperate for a moment of peace rather than a dance partner." "Then we are kindred spirits," he said, executing a bow that managed to be both correct and slightly mocking. "Philip Waverley at your service, solicitor, occasional poet, and perpetual disappointment to my family's expectations." "Vivienne Carter," she responded, surprised by her own willingness to engage. "Spinster, reluctant heiress, and subject of considerable speculation." "Ah," Mr. Waverley said, his eyes brightening with recognition. "The niece of Lord Edmund Carter. I heard about the unusual terms of the inheritance. A marriage clause with a 6-month deadline. How delightfully Gothic." "Gothic is not the word I would have chosen," Vivienne said dryly. "Manipulative, perhaps, infuriating, certainly." "But not without a certain poetic appeal," Mr. Waverley suggested. "An aging uncle's final attempt to secure his niece's happiness, a race against time to find true love before the deadline expires. It is the stuff of novels." "Novels end happily because the author wills it so," Vivienne countered. "Real life is considerably more complicated." "Then perhaps we should make our own story," Mr. Waverley said, his tone shifting to something more serious. "One where a lady of intelligence and grace finds herself unexpectedly pursued by a gentleman who values minds over dowries and conversation over convention." Vivienne felt a flutter of something she could not quite name, hope, perhaps, or simply surprise. "That is a lovely sentiment, Mr. Waverley, but we have only just met." "Which means we have 5.5 months to discover if that sentiment might grow into something more substantial," he replied. "If you would permit me to call on you, Miss Carter, I would very much like to explore that possibility." Before she could respond, a familiar voice spoke from behind them. "Miss Carter, Mr. Waverley." Vivienne turned to find Lord York standing a few feet away, his expression unreadable. He was dressed in impeccable evening attire, his dark coat emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders, his cravat tied with understated elegance. Several matrons and their daughters stood a discreet distance away, clearly hoping for an introduction. "Lord York," Vivienne said, surprised by how the simple sight of him steadied something inside her. "I did not know you were acquainted with Mr. Waverley." "We have met," Lord York said, his gaze moving to the younger man with cool assessment. "Waverley is a solicitor with Marsh and Associates, I believe. They handle some minor business for one of my estates." "Minor business indeed," Mr. Waverley agreed with easy charm. "Though I aspire to more significant matters, perhaps even matters of the heart." The last words were directed at Vivienne, accompanied by a smile that would have charmed birds from trees. But she noticed that Lord York's expression had grown colder, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "How fortunate," Lord York said, his tone suggesting he found it anything but. "Miss Carter, I wonder if you might spare me a dance. I believe the next set is a quadrille, which should suit our purposes." It was not a question, though he phrased it as one. Vivienne found herself nodding before she had quite decided to do so. "Of course, my lord." "Until next time, Miss Carter," Mr. Waverley said, bowing gracefully. "I shall call on you next week, if I may." Lord York offered his arm, and Vivienne placed her gloved hand on his sleeve, feeling the solid warmth of him even through layers of fabric. He led her onto the dance floor as the musicians began the opening strains, other couples forming the traditional square around them. "Was that necessary?" Vivienne asked quietly as they moved through the first figures of the dance. "Was what necessary?" Lord York replied, his tone carefully neutral. Interrupting my conversation, asserting your authority as executor, making it clear that you have some claim on my time. I made nothing clear except that I wished to dance, Lord York said. If Mr. Waverley chose to interpret that as a territorial display, that speaks more to his own insecurities than my intentions. Vivian studied his face as they circled each other, the dance bringing them close and then separating them in the stylized pattern. You do not like him. I do not know him well enough to form an opinion, Lord York said, though his tone suggested otherwise. But I am familiar with his circumstances. 3 years ago, he was on the verge of being dismissed from his position due to irregularities in client accounts. Only the intervention of a senior partner saved his position. Irregularities, Vivian repeated, her stomach tightening. What manner of irregularities? Nothing proven, Lord York said carefully. But there were questions about gambling debts and loans taken against future commissions. He has since developed a reputation for courting wealthy widows and heiresses. The music swelled around them as they completed another figure, Vivian's hand briefly clasping Lord York's before they separated again. You think he is pursuing me for my inheritance? I think you should be cautious, Lord York said. You have 5 months remaining before the deadline. That is time enough to make an informed choice, but also time enough to be deceived by someone skilled in deception. Anger sparked in Vivian's chest, hot and sudden. And you, as executor, feel it is your duty to protect me from my own foolishness? I feel it is my duty to provide you with information that might inform your decisions, Lord York replied, his voice dropping lower as they moved close together once more. What you do with that information is entirely your choice. How very generous of you, Vivian said, unable to keep the bite from her tone, to allow me the illusion of choice while ensuring I know that you are watching, judging, ready to declare any marriage I might make as false if it does not meet your standards of authenticity. Lord York's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. That is not my intention. Then what is your intention, my lord? Vivian demanded, as the dance brought them face to face once more. To execute my uncle's will, to ensure I make the correct choice, or simply to remind me that I am not truly free, that someone else still controls my future. The music ended before he could respond. The other dancers began to melt into the crowd around them. Lord York stood frozen for a moment. His grey eyes seemed to measure her very soul with an intensity that made her breath catch. My intention, he said finally, so quietly that only she could hear, is to see you happy, even if that happiness comes at the cost of my own peace. He bowed, formal and distant, and departed before she could ask what he meant. The weeks leading up to Christmas brought a peculiar routine. Mr. Philip Waverley called on Vivian 3 times each week, arriving with flowers and books of poetry, engaging her in conversations that ranged from literature to current events. He was charming and attentive, treating her intelligence as an asset rather than an oddity. When he spoke of his modest but respectable practice, his hopes for the future, his appreciation for companions of the mind rather than mere beauty, Vivian found herself almost believing in the possibility of affection. Almost. Lord York, meanwhile, maintained a careful distance. He sent regular correspondence regarding the management of Willowmere Estate, asking her opinion on matters of staffing and repairs, treating her as the future owner rather than a temporary beneficiary. But he did not call on her, did not attend the same social events, did not offer any further warnings about Mr. Waverley's character. His absence felt louder than his presence had ever been. You're thinking of him again, Mrs. Dawson observed one morning as Vivian stood at her window, watching the frost-laden streets below. I am thinking of several people, Vivian replied, though she knew exactly whom Mrs. Dawson meant. Mr. Waverley will be calling this afternoon. I should probably decide how to respond to his continued attentions. Mr. Waverley, Mrs. Dawson repeated, with the kind of skepticism that only a trusted servant could express. The gentleman who arrives with expensive flowers, purchased from Covent Garden, when he claims to be supporting himself on a solicitor's salary. The one whose boots are polished to perfection, but whose cuffs show signs of frequent mending. Vivian turned from the window. You have been observing him closely. Someone must, Mrs. Dawson said tartly. and you're too busy wondering why Lord York has stayed away to notice the details." The observation struck too close to truth. Vivian returned to her chair, picking up the book of poetry Mr. Waverley had brought on his last visit. "Lord York is the executor of my uncle's will," she said carefully. "His distance is appropriate. It would be improper for him to appear to influence my choice of husband." "Improper, Mrs." Dawson echoed, her tone suggesting volumes of unspoken opinion. "And yet he writes to you every week about matters of drainage and tenant cottages, seeking your thoughts on decisions that any estate manager could make without consultation." "He is treating me with respect," Vivian protested, "acknowledging that I will inherit Willowmere, that I should have a voice in its management." "He is making excuses to remain in contact," Mrs. Dawson corrected. "Though why he tortures himself by staying away when he clearly wishes to be here I cannot fathom. Stubborn man." "You presume too much," Vivian said, though her protest lacked conviction. "Do I?" Mrs. Dawson moved to the window, looking down at the street where a familiar carriage had just appeared. "Then perhaps you can explain why Lord York's carriage is parked across the street 3 afternoons a week, at precisely the time when Mr. Waverley calls on you." Vivian rose and joined her housekeeper at the window. Sure enough, the distinctive black carriage with the York crest sat half hidden by an elm tree, its occupant invisible behind curtained windows. Her heart performed an odd flutter, part exasperation and part something she dared not name. "He is watching," she breathed. "He is torturing himself," Mrs. Dawson corrected. "Watching another man court the woman he wants, but will not allow himself to pursue." "That is absurd," Vivian said, though her voice lacked certainty. "My lord, a man of his consequence, barely knows me. We have met perhaps a dozen times." "And yet he knew to interrupt when Mr. Waverley was pressing his advantage at Lady Helmsworth's ball," Mrs. Dawson pointed out. "And yet he writes to you weekly with questions that require thoughtful answers. And yet he sits in his carriage in the cold, rather than going about his business like a sensible person." Before Vivian could respond, a knock sounded at the door. Mr. Waverley arriving precisely on time as always, bearing a bouquet of hothouse roses that must have cost a week's salary. "I should receive him," Vivian said, though her gaze remained fixed on the black carriage across the street. "You should," Mrs. Dawson agreed. "But perhaps you might also consider asking yourself why you spend these visits wondering what Lord York is thinking, rather than attending to the gentleman who is actually present." The observation haunted Vivienne throughout Mr. Waverley's call. He read poetry aloud, his voice melodious and practiced. He complimented her appearance, her intelligence, her grace. He spoke of his growing affection, his hope that they might find companionship in a world that too often valued mere outward accomplishments over true connection. And through it all, Vivian found her attention drifting to the window, to the black carriage that sat motionless in the December cold. When Mr. Waverley finally departed, pressing her hand with meaningful warmth and promising to call again in 2 days' time, Vivian made a decision that surprised even herself. She donned her warmest cloak, instructed Mrs. Dawson that she would return within the hour, and crossed the street to the waiting carriage. The footman looked startled when she appeared at the carriage door, but he recovered quickly enough to open it for her. Lord York sat within, his expression transforming from surprise to something more complicated as she climbed in without invitation. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "This is unexpected." "I could say the same," Vivian replied, settling onto the seat across from him. The interior of the carriage was warm despite the winter chill, a small brazier providing heat. "About your presence here. 3 afternoons each week, Mrs. Dawson tells me." Lord York had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I did not intend to be observed." "Then you should have chosen a less distinctive carriage," Vivian said. "Or perhaps you should not have positioned yourself where my housekeeper could see you from the drawing-room window." "Perhaps," he agreed quietly. They sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the street muffled by the carriage walls. Vivian studied the man across from her, noting the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands rested on his knees as though he did not trust himself to relax. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why do you watch when you could simply call? When you could offer your own suit if you had any interest in doing so?" Lord York's expression grew pained, Because I am the executor of your uncle's will. Because any relationship between us would be tainted by questions of influence and propriety. Because you deserve the freedom to make your choice without the weight of my position affecting that decision. And yet you sit here in the cold while another man courts me, Vivian said softly. If that is not a form of influence, I do not know what is. It is weakness, Lord York said, his voice rougher than she had ever heard it. It is the weakness of a man who knows he should stay away but finds himself incapable of doing so, who watches another man offer you flowers and poetry while remaining silent about his own feelings because duty demands it. Vivian's breath caught. Your own feelings. Do not ask me to speak them, Lord York said, his grey eyes meeting hers with desperate intensity. Do not ask me to compromise your freedom with a declaration that would only complicate your situation further. You have until March to make your choice. That choice should be made without consideration of what I might feel. And what if I wish to consider it? Vivian demanded. What if I am tired of men making decisions about what I should or should not know, what I am capable of handling? My uncle decided I needed to be forced into marriage. You decided I needed to be protected from my own feelings. Mr. Waverley decides when to court me and how. When do I get to decide what information I require to make my own choice? The words hung between them, sharp and true. Lord York closed his eyes briefly, his jaw working as though wrestling with something painful. You are right, he said finally. You have every right to know, and you have every right to be angry that yet another man presumed to know what was best for you. Then tell me, Vivian said, leaning forward. Tell me why you watch. Tell me what my uncle's will has prevented you from saying. Lord York was quiet for so long that Vivian thought he might refuse. Then he spoke, his voice low and weighted with years of silence. 5 years ago, I attended a lecture at the Royal Society. My wife had died 6 months earlier, and I was lost in grief, attending events mechanically because it seemed better than sitting alone in my house counting the hours. The lecture was on botanical classification, dry as dust, and I planned to leave at the interval. He paused, his gaze distant with memory. Then a woman in the third row asked a question about the relationship between native and imported species, about the ways that plants adapted to new environments, and whether that adaptation represented evolution or mere survival. The question was brilliant, nuanced, demonstrating both deep knowledge and genuine curiosity. The lecturer stumbled through his answer, clearly not having considered the implications she had raised. Vivian's heart began to beat faster. That was me. I remember that lecture. I remember the lecturer's irritation at being questioned. I turned to see who had asked such a question, Lord York continued, and I saw you, 23 years old, wearing a plain dress and sitting alone, your expression suggesting you expected to be dismissed or mocked. Instead, 3 men around you were looking at you with respect, engaging you in discussion. You lit up like a candle when you realized they were taking you seriously. I did not know you were there. Why would you? Lord York said simply. I was just another grieving widower in a room full of scholars, but I could not stop thinking about you afterward, about the brilliance of your question, the life in your eyes when you discussed ideas that mattered to you. I asked around discreetly and learned your name, learned that you were Lord Edmund Carter's niece, that you corresponded with him about scientific matters. You told him, Vivian breathed, understanding dawning. You told my uncle about me. I did, Lord York confirmed. Edmund was fascinated. He began writing to you, engaging you in the kind of discourse you deserved. And I told myself that this was enough, that connecting you with someone who could appreciate your mind was all I could offer. I was still wrestling with the betrayal of my wife's memory, still convinced that loving anyone else would be a betrayal of her. And then my uncle included you in his will, Vivian said, the pieces falling into place. He made you the executor, the judge of any marriage I might make. He trapped us both, Lord York said with a bitter laugh. He saw what I felt, what I was too cowardly to acknowledge even to myself, and he created a situation where I would have to watch you be courted by others, unable to declare my own interest without seeming to abuse my position. It was punishment and gift, both. Vivian felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. All these years she had thought herself invisible, overlooked, passing through life like a ghost. But this man, This reserved and wounded aristocrat had been watching, had been feeling, had been trapped by the same uncle who had tried to orchestrate her happiness. "You could have told me," she said quietly. "When you first came to my cottage, you could have explained, and put even more pressure on you." Lord York shook his head. "No, you deserved the freedom to make your choice without the weight of my feelings influencing that decision. If you found affection with Waverley or another, I would execute the will as Edmund intended and step aside. Even though it would destroy you to do so," Vivian said, seeing the truth of it in his eyes. "Even then," he agreed, "because your happiness matters more than my peace." The carriage seemed impossibly small, the air between them charged with years of unspoken feeling. Vivian felt the weight of decision pressing down on her, the awareness that this moment would shape everything that followed. "Mr. Waverley will propose soon," she said. "He has been building to it for weeks. The flowers, the poetry, the meaningful looks and pressed hands. He believes I will accept." "Will you?" Lord York asked, and there was such carefully controlled pain in the question that Vivian's throat tightened. "I do not know," she answered honestly. "He is kind. He is attentive. He claims to value my intelligence, my character. On paper, he is everything I should want. And yet..." "And yet," Lord York prompted when she trailed off. "And yet, when he reads me poetry, I find myself thinking about estate management," Vivian said, a laugh catching in her throat. "When he brings me flowers, I wonder what you thought of my last letter about the tenant cottages. When he speaks of affection, I feel nothing except a vague sense of obligation. Is that not absurd?" "It is not absurd," Lord York said quietly. "It is your heart telling you something your mind has not yet accepted." "And what is my heart telling me?" Vivian asked, though she suspected she already knew. Lord York leaned forward, close enough that she could see the flecks of blue in his grey eyes, the fine lines that bracketed his mouth. "That is for you to discover, Miss Carter, not for me to influence." "Even now?" Vivian breathed. "Even after you have told me everything, you will not state your feelings plainly?" "I will state them plainly when you are free to receive them without pressure," Lord York said. "When the deadline has passed or been met, when the inheritance is settled, when you can hear my words without wondering if I am trying to manipulate you into a choice that serves my interests." "That is very noble," Vivian said, frustration and admiration warring in her chest. "And very vexing." "I am aware," Lord York said with the ghost of a smile. "But I have waited 5 years. I can wait 3 more months." Vivian wanted to argue, to demand that he speak the words she suspected he was holding back, but she also recognized the honor in his restraint, the way he was choosing her freedom over his own desires. It was maddening and moving in equal measure. She opened the carriage door, allowing the winter cold to rush in. "Then I suppose we both have 3 months to determine what we truly want." "Indeed," Lord York agreed. "Though I suspect you already know, Miss Carter. You simply need to allow yourself to believe it." Vivian returned to her cottage with her mind in turmoil and her heart beating an unfamiliar rhythm. Mrs. Dawson took one look at her face and said nothing, merely preparing tea and leaving her to her thoughts. The following weeks brought a new awareness to Vivian's interactions. When Mr. Waverley called, she found herself noting the things Lord York had mentioned: the expensive flowers that seemed beyond a solicitor's means, the perfect polish of his appearance masking subtle signs of financial strain, the way his compliments felt practiced, as though he had delivered similar words to other women in similar circumstances. She also noticed the things Lord York had not mentioned, the way Mr. Waverley's attention sharpened whenever she spoke of the inheritance, the subtle pressure in his questions about the deadline, about Lord York's role as executor, the increasing urgency in his manner as January turned to February. When he finally proposed on a cold February afternoon, Vivian was not surprised. They were walking in the small park near her cottage, Mr. Waverley having suggested the outing despite the threatening clouds. He had been more animated than usual, his conversation touching repeatedly on themes of companionship and mutual support, the advantages of partners who understood each other's minds. "Miss Carter," he said finally, stopping beside a bare oak tree and taking her hands in his. "Vivian, if I may be so bold," These past months have been among the happiest of my life. Your intelligence, your grace, your remarkable character have captured my admiration entirely. It would, I confess, be a relief to both of us to settle your future, given the lateness of the hour. Mr. Waverley, Vivian began, but he pressed on, the words tumbling out with practiced fluency. I know that your circumstances are unusual, that the deadline established by your uncle's will has created pressure that should not exist in matters of the heart. But I hope you will believe me when I say that my affection for you is entirely genuine, that I would wish to marry you regardless of your inheritance. The words were pretty, the delivery was polished, and Vivian felt nothing except a growing sense of sadness for them both. You are very kind, she said gently, and I am honored by your regard, but I find that I would rather lose the inheritance than enter into a marriage without genuine affection. But affection can grow, he protested, his grip on her hands tightening. Many marriages begin with respect and friendship and develop into deeper feeling over time. I would be patient, Vivian. I would give you all the time you needed. I have had months, Vivian said, carefully extracting her hands from his, and in that time I have come to understand that respect and friendship, while valuable, are not enough for me. I need more than that. I need what my uncle tried to force me toward, what he himself was too cowardly to pursue. I need love, Mr. Waverley. Real, complicated, inconvenient love. Mr. Waverley's expression hardened, the charming mask slipping to reveal something colder beneath. You are making a mistake. You have only a month remaining before the deadline. Do you truly believe another suitor will appear in time? One who meets your apparently elevated standards? Perhaps not, Vivian admitted. But I would rather lose Willowmere than marry a man who sees me as a solution to his financial difficulties rather than a person worth knowing. The accusation hit its mark. Mr. Waverley's face flushed, anger and embarrassment warring in his expression. You accuse me of fortune hunting. You who have been desperately seeking a husband these past months, like every other aging spinster afraid of dying alone. I accuse you of nothing except being human, Vivian said quietly, refusing to let the cruel words wound her as they might have months ago. We all have our reasons for the choices we make, but I will not marry you, Mr. Waverley. I regret that your hopes must be disappointed. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him standing beneath the bare oak tree with February wind cutting through his carefully tailored coat. When she reached her cottage, she found Lord York's carriage waiting. The man himself stood on her doorstep, deep in conversation with Mrs. Dawson. He turned as Vivian approached, his expression transforming from concern to relief. Miss Carter, I apologize for calling unannounced, but I felt you should be aware of something that has come to my attention. Regarding Mr. Waverley? Vivian guessed, climbing the steps to stand beside him. Lord York's eyebrows rose. You know. I have recently acquired some clarity, Vivian said dryly, though I would be interested to hear what you have discovered. They moved inside, Mrs. Dawson disappearing with admirable discretion. Lord York removed a folder from his coat, laying several documents on the small table in the drawing room. My solicitor conducted a discreet inquiry at my request, he said. Mr. Philip Waverley is £4,000 in debt, primarily from gambling losses at several clubs in St. James. His practice has been struggling for the past year. He was on the verge of dismissal when news of your inheritance became public. Several acquaintances report that he boasted of securing an heiress before Christmas. Vivian studied the documents, feeling more resignation than surprise. I should be angry. I should feel betrayed. You should, Lord York agreed. He deceived you deliberately, crafted a courtship designed to prey on your isolation and the pressure of the deadline. And yet I find I am simply tired, Vivian said. Tired of being seen as a problem to be solved, a fortune to be secured, a deadline to be met. Even my uncle, who supposedly loved me, saw me as a project requiring management. She moved to the window, looking out at the familiar street with different eyes. Do you know what I have realized, Lord York? I spent 8 years convincing myself that I was content with invisibility because I was afraid of being seen and judged wanting. And now I have spent months being seen only for my inheritance, which is perhaps worse. At least when I was invisible, I could pretend it was my choice. Lord York was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice a deep, steady tone that made her turn to look at him. "You are not invisible to me, Miss Carter. You never have been. Because my uncle told you to watch over me," Vivian said, though without heat. "Because the will made me your responsibility." "No," Lord York said, crossing the room to stand before her. "Because 5 years ago I heard you ask a question that made an entire room reconsider their assumptions. Because your letters about estate management show not just intelligence, but genuine care for the people who depend on Willowmere. Because when I watch you navigate the marriage market that has treated you so cruelly, I see not bitterness, but resilience, not surrender, but dignity." He was close enough now that Vivian could see the pulse beating at his throat, could smell the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that lingered upon his coat. "I see you, Vivian Carter," he continued, her name falling from his lips like a revelation. "I have seen you for 5 years, and I will continue to see you whether the deadline passes unmet, or whether you find another suitor, or whether you decide that marriage is not what you want after all. Your visibility does not depend on anyone's approval, least of all mine." Tears burned in Vivian's eyes, unexpected and overwhelming. "That is a very fine speech, my lord, but we both know that if I do not marry within the next month, I lose everything my uncle left me. I will return to my cottage and my modest allowance and my careful economy, and you will return to your estates and your responsibilities, and we will exchange polite letters about nothing of consequence." "Is that what you believe?" Lord York asked, something fierce entering his expression. "That I have spent 5 years watching you from a distance, waiting for my chance, only to walk away if the inheritance falls through?" "I believe," Vivian said carefully, "that you are too honorable to pursue me while you hold power over my financial future. That once the deadline passes and the inheritance goes to my cousin Reginald, you will finally feel free to declare your feelings. But by then I will know that you waited until I had nothing to offer except myself, and I will wonder if your interest is pity rather than genuine regard." "Pity," Lord York repeated, the word seeming to pain him. "You think what I feel is pity?" "I think," Vivian said, "that you are a good man who sees someone in difficulty and wishes to help. That your friendship with my uncle has created a sense of obligation. That your own experience with grief and loss has made you sensitive to others' pain. All admirable qualities, my lord, but not the same as love." Lord York stared at her for a long moment, conflict clear in his grey eyes. Then, with a suddenness that stole her breath, he closed the distance between them and cupped her face in his hands. "Then let me be perfectly clear," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "I have loved you since the moment you asked that question 5 years ago. My heart has belonged to you through every letter, every glimpse of you at social events, every conversation we have shared. I have watched other men court you and felt physical pain at the thought of you choosing one of them. Not because of the inheritance, not because of obligation, but because you are brilliant and brave and beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with conventional standards. Because when you speak, I want to listen. When you struggle, I want to support you. When you laugh, which is far too rare, I feel as though the sun has broken through clouds." His thumbs brushed against her cheekbones, wiping away tears she had not realized were falling. "I have stayed silent because I am the executor, and any declaration from me would seem like coercion," he continued. "But I will be silent no longer. Marry me, Vivian, not because of the deadline or the inheritance, not because you are running out of options, but because I love you, and I believe, though you have not said so, that you might love me too." Vivian's breath came in short, sharp gasps, her heart pounding so loudly she thought he must surely hear it. "You are right. I do love you. I have been falling in love with you through every letter, every carefully worded response about drainage and tenant cottages. I love the way you honor my intelligence, the way you have protected my freedom even at cost to yourself. I love your restraint and your honor, and the fact that you have waited so patiently when waiting must have been torture. My rejection of Waverley today was the proof that my choice is free." "Then marry me," he repeated, the words half command, half plea. "Marry me and we will make Willowmere a home together. We will study botanical specimens and debate agricultural improvements and build a life that neither of us could have imagined." Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you were seen, you were valued, you were loved all along." "Yes," Vivian breathed, the word escaping before she could consider the implications. "Yes, I will marry you. Not because of the inheritance, though I confess I will be relieved to keep it. Not because of the deadline, though the timing is dramatic enough to satisfy even Mr. Waverley's taste for poetry, but because you are right. I do love you, and I am tired of being afraid of that love." Lord York's expression transformed, joy breaking across his features like sunrise. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to retreat if she wished, then kissed her with a gentleness that stole whatever words remained unspoken. When they finally separated, both breathless and slightly dazed, Mrs. Dawson appeared in the doorway as if summoned by invisible signal. "I assume congratulations are in order?" she asked dryly. "They are," Lord York confirmed, though his gaze never left Vivian's face. "Miss Carter has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my proposal." "About time," Mrs. Dawson muttered. "I'll prepare tea, and perhaps something stronger for the shock of it." The weeks that followed brought their own complications. Word spread quickly that Miss Vivian Carter, the heiress with the marriage deadline, had accepted a proposal from Lord Sebastian Montgomery, Marquess of York, the very man who served as executor of the will that had created her unusual circumstances. The gossips, eager only for malice and scandal, immediately began speculating about impropriety and influence. Had Lord York manipulated Miss Carter into accepting him? Had he abused his position of power? Was the marriage truly genuine or merely a convenient solution to an awkward situation? Lord York responded by requesting an investigation by the Court of Chancery, voluntarily submitting to examination of his conduct as executor. He provided documentation of every interaction with Vivian, every letter exchanged, every decision made. He made it clear that he would rather delay the marriage and face public scrutiny than allow questions about coercion to taint their union. The investigation lasted 3 weeks. During that time, Vivian was interviewed separately, asked to detail the circumstances of their courtship. Questioned about whether she felt pressured or influenced by Lord York's position, she answered every question honestly, describing his restraint, his protection of her freedom to choose, his refusal to declare his feelings, until she had rejected other suitors. She spoke of the 5 years he had waited, watching from a distance, honoring his friend's memory while wrestling with his own desires. When the investigators asked if she loved him, she said simply, yes, and dared them to question the truth she heard in her own voice. The Court of Chancery delivered its verdict in late February. The court confirmed that Lord York had conducted himself with propriety and honor throughout the execution of the will. The marriage, while unusual in its circumstances, appeared to be entirely genuine. Miss Carter was declared to be of sound mind and free will, capable of making her own decisions without undue influence. They were married on the 15th of March, 1819, in a small ceremony at the church near Willowmere Estate. The bride wore a gown of ivory silk with lace at the sleeves, simple and elegant. The groom stood at the altar with tears in his eyes, no longer attempting to hide his feelings behind restraint and duty. Vivian's cousin Reginald Montford attended, having sent a letter acknowledging that the inheritance had gone to the person who truly deserved it. Several of Lord York's closest friends filled the pews, along with Mrs. Dawson and a handful of servants who had served the Carter family for decades. The vicar, who had known Vivian since childhood, smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife. "You have waited long for this happiness," he told them quietly. "May it be worth the wait." "It already is," Vivian replied, her hand clasped in her husband's, her heart fuller than she had ever imagined possible. The wedding breakfast was held at Willowmere, the estate that had seemed like a prison when Vivian first learned of its conditions, now converted to hope. Lord York, now properly her husband, though she still thought of him as Sebastian in her mind, led her through the gardens after the guests had departed, showing her the botanical specimens her uncle had collected over 30 years. "He left notes," Sebastian said, producing a leather-bound journal from his coat. "Instructions for their care, observations about their growth patterns, and at the end a letter for you." Vivian accepted the journal with trembling hands, opening to the final pages where her uncle's distinctive script filled the margins. "My dear Vivian," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my gambit has succeeded and you have married Lord York. Or perhaps you have defied me entirely and chosen your own path, in which case I applaud your courage and only regret that I will not be present to witness it. I spent 30 years collecting these specimens, studying their patterns, learning how they adapt and thrive in new environments. And I learned this. Survival is not the same as flourishing. One can exist in careful stability, preserved but not growing, protected but not truly alive. I was such a specimen, carefully cultivated, protected from risk, surviving in my controlled environment, but never truly flourishing. I chose safety over love, duty over desire. And I spent 3 decades regretting that choice. Do not let the fate that was forced upon me by my father's pride ever be yours. I did not want that fate for you. I saw how you were creating your own careful stability, convincing yourself that invisibility was preference rather than fear. And I saw Sebastian watching you with the same longing I once felt for the woman I was too cowardly to claim. Forgive me for forcing your hand. Forgive me for using money and inheritance to push you toward a choice you might have been too afraid to make on your own. But know this, I did not do it to control you. I did it to free you from the fear that was controlling you both. If you chose Sebastian, then you have found what I lost. If you chose another path, then you have proven yourself braver than I ever was. Either way, I hope you will remember your uncle, not with anger, but with understanding. We all struggle with courage. Some of us simply struggle longer than others. The specimens are yours now. Tend them well. Let them flourish as I hope you will flourish. With love and perhaps too much meddling, Edmund Vivienne closed the journal, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. Sebastian drew her close, his arms wrapping around her with a protectiveness that no longer felt like limitation, but like home. He was right, she said against his chest, about fear, about survival versus flourishing. I told myself I was content, but I was just hiding. We both were, Sebastian murmured into her hair, hiding behind duty and grief and all the excellent excuses we constructed to avoid risking our hearts again. And now? Vivienne asked, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. Now we flourish, Sebastian said simply. Together. 5 years later, Willowmere Estate had transformed from a neglected property into a model of progressive agricultural management. The tenant cottages had been rebuilt with modern conveniences. The gardens, carefully tended according to Lord Edmund's notes, had become a destination for botanical scholars from across Europe. And the manor house itself rang with the sounds of life in ways it never had during Edmund's solitary decades. Lady Vivienne Montgomery, Marchioness of York, sat at her desk in the library, reviewing the proofs for her latest publication. Essays on agricultural innovation and botanical adaptation had been accepted by a prominent publisher, to be released under her own name rather than anonymously. Her husband had insisted, overriding her concerns about propriety with the observation that hiding her light had never served her well before. Their 3 children, ranging in age from 4 years to 8 months, were currently under the supervision of their capable nurse. But Vivienne could hear their laughter drifting through the open windows, a sound that never failed to make her smile. Sebastian appeared in the doorway, still in riding clothes from inspecting the northern fields. He carried their youngest daughter, little Margaret, who had apparently staged a successful escape from the nursery. Someone was asking for her mama, he said, crossing the room to kiss Vivienne's cheek before depositing the baby in her arms. And I confess I used it as an excuse to interrupt your work and steal a moment with my wife. Shameless, Vivienne said, though she welcomed both the interruption and the solid warmth of his presence beside her chair. Entirely, Sebastian agreed. How are the proofs? Nearly finished, though I suspect the publisher will suggest revisions to several of the more controversial proposals. Then they would be fools, Sebastian said. Your work on crop rotation alone has saved 3 estates from financial ruin. Let them object. We will find another publisher. Vivienne leaned her head against his shoulder, marveling as she still did at the ease between them, the partnership they had built from forced deadlines and reluctant confessions. Do you ever regret it? The scandal, the investigation, the gossip that took months to die down. Not for a single moment, Sebastian said firmly, though I regret the years I wasted watching from a distance when I could have been building this life with you. Your restraint was necessary, Vivienne reminded him. Without it, we would always have wondered if the choice was truly free. Perhaps, Sebastian conceded. But I still lost time. Time I can never recover. Then we must make the most of the time we have, Vivienne said, claiming his lips fully, their daughter giggling between them at the display. They visited Lord Edmund's grave each year on the anniversary of his death, bringing flowers from the gardens he had cultivated and gratitude for the interference that had seemed so infuriating in the moment. The gravestone bore a simple inscription: Edmund Carter, beloved friend, reluctant matchmaker, keeper of botanical specimens and uncomfortable truths. Sebastian had chosen the words himself over Vivienne's laughing protests, but she admitted they suited him perfectly. Her uncle had never been one for conventional sentiment, and even in death he would have appreciated the honesty. Standing there with her husband's hand warm in hers, their children playing among the peaceful graves, Vivienne reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this moment, the inheritance that had seemed like a curse, the deadline that had appeared to trap her, the man who had waited 5 years to declare his love. All of it had been necessary, the push she needed to stop hiding, the proof that she was seen, valued, loved not for what she possessed, but for who she was. Mr. Philip Waverley had fled to the continent after his debts had become public, his reputation thoroughly destroyed. Vivienne heard occasional reports of him attempting to court wealthy widows in Italy or France, always unsuccessful, always one step ahead of creditors. She felt no triumph in his downfall, only a distant pity for a man who had never learned that shortcuts always extracted their price eventually. As for being called unmarriageable at 28, Vivienne had come to see it as the world's failure of imagination rather than her own deficiency. She had not been unmarriageable. She had simply been waiting for a marriage worth having, for a partner who saw her mind as clearly as her circumstances, who valued her courage as much as her inheritance. She had found that partner, not through the deadline or the manipulation or the forced choices, but through years of patient observation, careful restraint, and the willingness of 2 wounded people to risk vulnerability one more time. "What are you thinking?" Sebastian asked as they walked back toward the house, their children racing ahead on the path. "That your friend Edmund was infuriating and meddlesome and absolutely right," Vivienne said, "and that I am grateful to him every day, even when I want to curse his memory for putting us through such unnecessary complications." "I suspect that would please him immensely," Sebastian said with a smile. "He always did enjoy being proven right, especially when his methods were questionable." "Then let us hope he is watching somehow," Vivienne said, "so he can see that his meddling, however uncomfortable, led to exactly what he hoped. Not just marriage, but partnership. Not just survival, but flourishing." They reached the house as the sun began to set, painting the Yorkshire sky in shades of gold and rose. Inside, the servants were preparing dinner. The nursery awaited their children. The library held Vivienne's work, Sebastian's correspondence, the shared life they had built from forced circumstances and genuine love. And in the gardens, Lord Edmund's botanical specimens continued their growth, adapting and thriving in the rich soil of Willowmere, proof that even the most carefully controlled life could break free of its constraints and reach toward the light. Thank you so much for staying with us until the end of this journey. If this story of second chances and hard-won love touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us continue creating stories of resilience, transformation, and hope.